So we're going to get started. So for those of you who are grabbing food and drink, please do so and grab a seat. My name is Sarah Reed. I'm a journalist based in Toronto and also a fellow at the Monk School of Global Affairs, a journalism fellow. And I will be moderating tonight's panel on Beyond the Border and Regulatory Cooperation Lessons Learned. As probably most of you know, President Obama and Prime Minister Stephen Harper signed the Beyond the Border Declaration, launched the Regulatory Cooperation Council, and set out the accompanying action plans all in 2011. After 9/11, thickening of the border, and several stops and starts to improving the situation at the world's largest border crossings, the action plan, I think, for a lot of people came as welcome news. But there was a little bit of trepidation as well. You know, we tried this a few times before. Was this going to be the time we got it right? As everybody in this room knows, Canada and the United States share the largest bilateral trading relationship in the world, with a value of goods and services crossing the border every day valued at over $2 billion. So it was very important to get this right. So tonight we're going to discuss the lessons learned and what still needs to be done. And as we look forward to the next 4 years, what BTB and RCC might turn into. So to very quickly introduce my panel, the bios for them will be in your booklet, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but starting very far down on the left, everybody knows this face already from seeing him up there all day. But Dan Utso is a Counsel and Cross-Border Business Development Director at Dickinson Wright, and he's based here in Columbus. Next we have Cindy Totem-Cherniak, who's the founder and principal of S.A.G.E, based in Toronto. Next, we have Elise Mahu, who's the business director for government markets and public affairs for 3M Canada in Ottawa. And we have Joy Knott, president and CEO of Importers and Exporters Canada, and she's based in Toronto. And finally, we have Jim Phillips, a very familiar face, president of the Canadian-American Border Trade Alliance in Lewiston, New York. So what I'm going to ask each of you to do to start out with is to very briefly give me a sense of your organization's work and how it relates to Canada-US relations. And then we'll get into a bit more of a fulsome discussion about the BTB and the RCC. So perhaps, Jim, if you want to start us out.
The Canadian-American Border Trade Alliance is a transcontinental and binational organization. In fact, it's the only one in existence. It runs across the border. Penmar on the west coast is a member of mine all the way to the east coast. We have about 60,000 companies and organizations in the network. 27 states participate, plus the Canadian provinces. We'll be 25 years old next year, and you didn't come to hear about my organization, so I just would offer www.canambta.org. You can find out exactly what we do and how we do it.
I'm sorry, Joy. That's okay. So that Elise can do it as well. Hi there, my name is Joy Knott, and I'm President and CEO of the Canadian Association of Importers and Exporters, otherwise known as S.A.G.E Canada. 2017 will actually be our 85th year of operation. We're a trade association that focuses on tariff and non-tariff trade barriers at the Canadian border for both importers and exporters. So that being said, we don't focus on interprovincial trade and domestic issues. It's all about trade and trade irritants, where you have other trade associations such as the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters Association, the Conference Board of Canada. There's a number of them that focus on macro-level international trade issues. We focus on micro. So our members are very much focused on the 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. And I say that with tongue-in-cheek because international trade is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But it's actually about solving trade irritant policies and operational issues at border crossings for all modes of transport. So we like to say that we're where the rubber hits the road and where the money's actually made. So we play in the weeds. Okay.
Good evening. I'm actually really impressed that you all stayed around for this. So my name is Elise Mahu. I'm with 3M Canada. So I'm responsible for government affairs. And actually, I'm also on the board of the Canadian Manufacturers Association, people dealing with for trade issue. So I guess most of you would know the existence of 3M. So it used to be Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, from not too far away from here, founded in 1902. Actually, they were trying to harvest a mineral, and they have been actually very unsuccessful. And this was actually the born of 3M, which is still alive today. So we're in $30 billion company in 70 countries, sells in 290,000 employees. And in Canada, we have 9 manufacturing sites. And basically, 90%, we have 60,000 products. And 90% of what we sell in Canada is imported from the US. And 90% of what we make in Canada is exported mainly to the US. So that's why regulatory cooperation and beyond the border is very important for us.
Hi, I'm Cindy Todgham-Cherniak, and I am an international trade and sales tax lawyer with S.A.G.E in Toronto in the Flatiron Building. I was on Bay Street for 20 years, and in 2012 decided I'd open a boutique so that I could work with more Canadian law firms and not have a conflict of interest. I've got a US law degree, a Canadian law degree, and a master's in international trade law. I've taught at the University of Windsor. I've taught at Case Western Reserve University School of Law in Cleveland, and the courses are always in cross-border trade issues and free trade agreements. I'm on the Judicial Advisory Committee to the Tax Court of Canada. I was appointed by the Minister of Justice to that position, and my practice is 80% is international trade law, border issues. I probably do more nexus pass confiscation work than any other Canadian lawyer. But I also do customs, anti-dump, export controls, WTO, NAFTA verifications. And I come by my trade background through my family. My grandfather was the first Canadian-born president of Chrysler Canada, and he was one of the architects of the Auto Pact. So it's in my blood, and it continues to be my focus.
Thank you. Just for posterity, since we're recording this again, I'm Dan Utso. I'm International Trade and Customs Attorney with Dickinson Wright, and as I mentioned earlier today, DW, and for those of you that are just joining us, Dickinson Wright is a firm headquartered since the 1870s in Detroit, are one of the few handful of US-based law firms that has full-service offices in Canada. Our Toronto office dates back to Confederation. For the Americans, that's about 1867, early 1870s. So we've been a long-standing legal services provider in the Great Lakes region on the front lines of Canada, US, and we are the only one that is in that key automation innovation alley down through here to Ohio, into the US Southeast via Kentucky and Nashville, where we also have a large Music Row practice. So for the country music fans, we represent a lot of the entertainers there, and into Florida, and then out through our North American trade corridors into the US Southwest in Phoenix, Vegas, and Reno, which the latter two, none of us spend as much time as we would like to in those offices, but that should be soon. My personal background at the firm, I should say, is before I came there, I spent 15 years in government, both in the US and Canadian government, the latter doing a border cooperation and then a regulatory affairs officer, so B2B, we called it border visioning at the time, and then RCC were part of my job description there, and before that I worked in the US government as an advisor to US DHS and the US Coast Guard, and then in the court system doing guns, drugs, and thugs. I should just note in passing, as we talk about the RCC, we won a competitive bid to advise OIRA, the White House, and PCO on issues related to the RCC, so we've been interviewing bureaucrats along with, in partnership with Chris Sands and John Hopkins Seiss, so we can talk a little bit about, it hasn't been released yet and it's not for public disclosure anyway, but we can talk a little bit about what we did. Most importantly, I'm an alum of this institute, and since it's a Wednesday night, I think we should probably play a drinking game. So every time you hear the word border thickening, take a drink, and then we'll go from there. So without further ado, I'll turn it back to you, Sarah.
Okay, all right. Well, drinking game sounds good. It'll make the discussion of regulatory alignment a little more thrilling. So the Beyond the Border Agreement, we know that there were 4 areas that they were seeking to address, addressing threats, cybersecurity and critical infrastructure, law enforcement, and of course, trade facilitation. The Regulatory Cooperation Council had something like 29 original recommendations to align regulations between Canada and the United States, from everything from creating a single window for customs to, as Dan put it to me earlier tonight, aligning regulations on car seats and lip gloss. So, Jim, maybe we'll start with you. What have been the successes of this initiative since 2011?
I'll come over, I think.
Sure.
Oops. Sorry to bother you.
No, that's worried.
Sorry. Good evening. Dan asked me to come and talk about specifically about the border, and said be specific. So what I'd like to do very quickly is walk you through what we perceive as being major impact achievements, what wasn't handled, and what didn't go so well as it should have, and then finally end up with a quick vision of what we think is the future for the border. On the major impact achievements, the signing of the pre-clearance agreement on March 15 was a tremendous, tremendous achievement. We need to, in order to get it done, we need to pass the privileges and protections legislation. I understand it's going to be tabled in Parliament tomorrow in Canada, and we're certainly working on some versions in the U.S., so hopefully that's on its way. Shiprider, which is the mixed crews on the boats, has been very successful. Nexus, Global Entry, and FastCard are all very, very successful programs. I just do want to point out that Nexus is about the number of trips that are made over the border, the land border. That's where savings are made with a Nexus card for inspection at the border. Unfortunately, most of the new Nexus cards are being enrolled because of the airport. You know, for $50 you can get a TSA pre-check for 80, or it will cost 85, and Global Entry all for 50. We just got to remember it's the number of trips, not the 1.4 million people that are enrolled. We're only at about 25% of the trips right now are using Vicinity RFID cards, so that's one to look at. Designated trusted trader programs have been a very success up to this point. CTPAT and PIP should be one program. You apply for one and you get both at some point. And secondly, of course, the benefits of being a trusted trader need to be enhanced before we're done. There's a very numerous number of improvements, both by CBP and CBSA and others at the borders, including meaningful progress on a lot of the Beyond the Border action plans. Too numerous to talk about, but very, very positive things. And elimination of cash collection by CBP officers. We got into the reorganization legislation that was just passed a couple of months ago, and the pilot is starting. 10,000 times a day, CBP officers handle cash at the borders, and we're going to replace that with both a handheld app, and also the DTOPs for the transponders will read, and no longer will cash be collected. So that's what's going forward. As far as pre-clearance is concerned, I stole a line from the United States Army. We need pre-clearance to be all it can be, and that involves paradigm shifting. This is a paradigm shifting treaty or agreement. It provides very high value, direct beneficial impacts. Cornwall Solution, CBSA going to the United States, ultimate peace bridge commercial processing, where both primary and secondary can move to the Fort Erie side. Small port inspection by two officers, one Canadian, one American. Hundreds of officers could be reassigned to other bridges if we in the 40 small ports, and a plan for that. Rail passenger, Vermont, Montreal to New York, Montreal to Vermont. That system has been held up since 2001. It can be reinstated, going from Montreal to Vermont, and of course Vancouver to Seattle. Secure transit corridor, which is Alan Burson's idea. Essentially, a CBP officer would be up at Oshawa in General Motors. They would seal the truck there, and with a special kind of seal, it would go to the border. If it was green, it goes through. and at the destination in Michigan, if it's still green, it gets unloaded. Very, very progressive approach to that. And the joint facilities, the pre-clearance will allow us to have joint facilities where we can share a bricks and mortar and a whole lot of other things, which may lead to joint processing zones. Not acted upon. Empty trucks, it was proposed that empty trucks should be required to have e-manifest. They use paper today. 30% of the trucks arrive at the U.S. border without any knowledge of CBP. They don't know the driver, they don't know the truck's coming, and until e-manifest is mandated, that will not be solved, and we're going to be working on that. All truck drivers should have a fast-type card to save 24 seconds per driver. If everybody had a vicinity RFID truck driver card, and you just key it in, so some would be fast, ultra secure, some would be PIP, which is less than fast, and some would be haven't done anything except I'm identifying myself, and you could get their identity. Passport Canada has chose not to issue a vicinity RFID passport companion card to this point. Again, there's 400,000 hours of wait time that Canadians are making at the border if Canadians had that kind of a vicinity RFID card. It's a big one that needs to be done. As far as future objectives, very quickly, the check once, accept twice needs to be expanded to check once and accept thrice. And that is where we get no load checking at the origin, and then we protect the trade lanes. And can you imagine a 10 or 12,000 TEU ship arriving that has been checked? Everything on it is only low risk, goes right on a rail, right on trucks, and it leaves the port the day it arrives, one after the other. That's the green lane that was envisioned. It has to be done so that there's no high risk or unknown gets loaded on any boat coming in. Commissioner Krelikowski recently announced that they have 700 additional officers are going to be hired to be assigned offshore. CBP currently has 800 officers that are out of country. And the rolling stop for trucks, we are working on the idea where, as a result of pre-clearance and secure transit corridors and enhanced trusted trader, that we get a rolling stop for a truck that are cleared. Complete the land rider negotiations. That's one that didn't work. It's hung up, where we were going to have law enforcement between the ports. P-clearance is about the ports or off-border. The land rider is what ship rider does on the water. It would be law enforcement on the land. And of course, pre-clearance is defined as primary and secondary in the other country. Pre-inspection was primary only. So those pilots led. We're essentially, the single window, I just want to point out, is really going forward. It will be achieved, I think, by the end of 16. That's the intent. But I want to just point out, single window cures one input so that all OGAs and OGDs get the data from the shipper, but it does not solve the hold at the border, where FDA is only there 8 hours a day, CBP is there 24. We made the point that if CBP is on site and the port is open, USDA, FDA, and anybody else had better cross-designate so CBP can release these. With the single window, FDA will know what's on the truck, and they should be able to avoid all those holes. Key to the future is essentially looking at our shared border. Canadian-U.S. information sharing is a serious constraint now. There's a lot of Canadian reluctance to share over privacy. We've got to redefine, without giving up privacy, things that should be shared so that we have a true perimeter clearance and a perimeter handling of shipments across the border. Information sharing is critical that we work it all out. Data mining for predictive analysis. I would just tell you, we did a data mining. We checked every truck that went across the border in 2014 at the Ambassador Bridge, the Peace Bridge, and found out that big three trucks, we split the time frames in every 30 seconds, 0 to 30, all the way up to whatever it took. Big three auto trucks cross in 17 seconds at the Ambassador Bridge, automated inspection. and there are 7% of the trucks that stay more than 5 minutes in the primary, and they take up 35% of the entire inspection time of the Ambassador Bridge. All the inspectors, 24/7, 35% are dealing with 7% of the trucks that take over 5 minutes. So just think about, this is something in the neighborhood of 17 to 20 3M trucks, big 3 auto trucks, that if they're stuck behind a 5-minute truck, 17 of those trucks could sit there for 5 minutes. And that's what we've got, this Monte Carlo. Whoever arrives first is first in line. We have to stream traffic. Joint shared border management is something that ought to be looked at, the NORAD model, where it's looked at with joint processing zones at the big bridge. Bottom line, we need to get beyond the border perimeter strategy and Canada-U.S. cooperation done and done right to include the must-haves as the global competitiveness and quality of life of both U.S. and Canada depend on it. Common sense must prevail. Find a way to make it work. Thank you very much. I shall sit.
Border thickening.
Listen, you got an ex-nose guard here who's trying to go by these lovely ladies. I don't want to knock them off the stage.
So Joy, for the importers and exporters, what have been the successes under these two initiatives?
I think, generally speaking, when you talk importers and exporters, they really fall into two categories. They fall into the large multinationals, and I think a lot of what Jim was just talking about, the large multinationals, for the most part, have been actively aware of them. But then you've got the small to medium-sized businesses. You know, as I like to say, the man from Markham, the woman from Winnipeg. Oh, okay. Is that better? Thank you. As I like to say, the man from Markham, the woman from Winnipeg, you know, small to medium-sized companies, they're not multinationals. They don't have deep pockets. They don't have all kinds of resources monitoring the types of things that Jim was just talking about. For them, the reality of shipping, for the most part, and all the information that they get comes through their service providers. So if you're going to talk the small to medium-sized businesses, beyond the border to them is nothing but some photo ops that they see the Prime Minister and the President do on the 6 o'clock news, and it has meant nothing tangible for their 9 to 5 daily business. For some of the large multinationals, I think that that's different. They're highly plugged in. They're influencing some of the changes that Jim was talking about. So, you know, I'm not trying to dodge your question. I'm saying it just all depends on who you're asking. If you ask, you know, that small to medium size, they're going to say beyond the border, is that still going? That's true. You know? So that's what I can say about that. Relative to one of the things that I think is I think, generally speaking, the majority of my members are very happy that Beyond the Border was even brought up, that it was thought of. They're happy that it's continuing. I think they're a little nervous because we have a new government in Canada and there's a U.S. election coming up, and then it all sort of, I think there's a little bit of trepidation what will happen post all the final elections, you know, settling and the dust settling. Will it actually continue and make some of the progress that we've talked about in all these years, and some of these programs, what will happen to them if there's a big shift in government or in policy or whatever else. But I think one of the things that's still a telling tale to say that there's still some irritants in the system, if you think about ISPM 15, the wood packaging material, and the fact that the United States is still thinking about, and they've still, you know, doing, I haven't gotten an update. Oh, cool, Cindy, just cool. Border thickening, Cindy's got her sunglasses on. When you think about the fact that the United States is thinking about mandating on the 49th parallel, the fact that Canadians would have to declare wood packaging and wood pallets and stuff going into the United States is the same as the rest of the world. To Jim's point, you know, from a Canadian perspective, we're saying that it should be the perimeter of North America, and it shouldn't be the 49th parallel, because that really is thickening of the border, so that's a legitimate use for that phrase, just so that you... there you go, cheers. So we're a little bit concerned because Canada's attitude on the ISPM 15 issue, just as one example, is the United States is moving ahead right now with their rulemaking. Granted, it's been an extraordinary amount of time, and I'm not a U.S. attorney, so I'll just say that on everything that I've been told, that rulemaking process has just been extraordinary by U.S. standards. It's moving at a snail's pace. But the Canadian attitude is what concerns us the most, and that the Canadian attitude for CFIA is that, well, if the Americans do it, we'll counter and we'll come up with Canadian regulations that pretty much mirror and harmonize and all the good things that you can say about beyond the border relative to, rule making that, fits and whatever. But that's really the wrong thing to do. Why are we focused on making more rules that don't exist today at the 49th parallel, especially when, insects, and don't get me wrong, I know that insects and there's various pests and diseases and whatever else that can come in wood packaging from around the world. But for the most part, Canadian shippers who ship a lot of wood packaging into the United States actually pay a premium to get Canadian indigenous wood in the packaging. So an insect doesn't actually know if it's in New Brunswick or Maine. The border is an artificial border created by man. Nature pretty much dictated how far a beetle's range is for certain species of beetles, and they don't actually know where they are geopolitically. So, I think while Beyond the Border has been positive as an initiative, there's still some, I'll call it sovereignty thumbprints that find their way, like an ISPM 15 issue.
So Elise, as somebody that comes from one of these multinational companies, have you seen successes under the Beyond the Border and RCC initiatives?
Have I seen what?
Successes? Sure.
So, yes, actually, I think we have seen successes. So obviously, when this came about at the end of 2011, we were in a different political environment. And the objective was to better align regulatory approaches. And so I will talk about more the RCC than the Beyond the Border. So you won't be able to use the thickening the border.
You said it, though.
That's it, I'm sorry. That's it. So I just want to bring a couple of highlights, actually, of what President Obama said a couple of months ago when our Prime Minister was here. And so he said that we don't always value our alliance and partnership, and we're woven together so deeply that sometimes it's easy to forget how truly remarkable our relationship is. So a shared border that is the longest between two nations in the world, and it's the largest bilateral economic relationship, and I know we all know that. When so many of our manufactured products are built on both sides of the border in an integrated supply chain, this co-production makes us more competitive in the global economy as a whole. So, and then he mentioned at the end that we're probably more closely aligned now than ever, and I think with the presidential election coming up, I think that's probably true because none of us actually know what's going to happen. And I think what's important is like he's talking about competitiveness about the region and not only about US and Canada. So Canada and US are totally integrated, and it's not only in the automotive sector. So 3M is a good example. As I said, we export 90% of what we make, and we import 90% of what we make. So regulatory alignment is actually, so the regulatory cooperation, like the lack of alignment is actually creating cost, and cost is making the region less competitive, and it's making products actually more expensive for both Canadians and Americans. So this co-production makes us more competitive as, in the global industry, and manufacturing really requires to be fluid, actually, in order to be competitive. So the RCC has achieved some great results. I think at this time, what we need is probably when both governments are in place is to redefine and rebrand and renew this initiative. So we should consider some of the learning, and so I will focus on 3 areas that I see that actually we should learn actually moving forward. So I will use an example because I've been quite heavily involved in that one, and it's what they call the GHS, which is the Global Harmonized System of Classification and Labeling of Chemicals for the workplace. So it's basically, the labels and the safety data sheets that are used on products that are going in aerospace manufacturing sites or in workplace. So basically, this is what companies use and what workers use to protect themselves, so they know what kind of equipment they need and what they need to be careful with. So what I'm going to talk about is not really 3M related. Actually, it's the position of the industry. So the ultimate goal from the RCC is to have one label and one safety data sheet on both sides of the border. So there's 3 things I think that we can do better. There's probably more than 3, but this one is the metrics. So metrics drive behaviors, and it defines what success is and if the initial intent of the objective was met. So the initial intent was really to eliminate unnecessary burdens and reduce cost. So, you know, I always remember Ambassador Jacobson when he was in Canada, and he talked about the Cheerios, because he repeated that everywhere in Canada, because he was saying that the American Cheerios would not be able to be sold as is in Canada, because Health Canada used to say that this was actually harmful, and he said that he felt pretty good actually eating American Cheerios. So, I mean, some people really recognize that one of the challenge of the RCC is not to be able to have some quantitative analysis of it. So when we're saying reduce cost, you know, it is difficult for the government actually to translate that in objectives and in metrics for them. So what they're doing is they're looking at variances between the 2 countries. They look at line by line, rule by rule, and they're trying to minimize the variances as they move along. And don't get me wrong, and I do realize how hard it is to do this. It's a lot of work for the officials to do so. So for the officials to come out and say we have actually harmonized more than 90% of the variances is actually a pretty good result. But from an industry perspective, so we're standing actually from a total different perspective. So for us, the 10% that they have not harmonized could be 30% of our volume. And we need exactly the same process, the same resources to be able to deal with those differences, because they have to catch them as they come along. So we still have the cost of the supply chain, the structure, and so if we're not fully harmonized, you know, we have the cost structure is not linear. I mean, it is, you have a minimum of cost that you have to carry just to be able to deal with those differences. So that's the first one. The second one is accountability. Somebody said to me in the other room about an hour ago that nobody talked about accountability. So the second one is accountability. So who's accountable for the results? So we had actually, through that example, that we had some variances that were not harmonized. So what do? So we go to the RCC saying go to see the lead department. The lead department is, yeah, okay, yeah, maybe we'll look at it. You go to the minister's office, you know, they have other things to do. So what resources do we have, and who is the gatekeeper actually in making sure that these get implemented? So some of the industry recommendation was to have a working group to address those variances, and so we have recommended that in the phase 2 that these would be implemented. And also that the process would be clear. In this case, I mean, industry stakeholders have been able to, obviously, to provide some input throughout the process, but there has been some step where industry was excluded, and at this time, we're still waiting for a guidance document. The deadline is in sight, and we still don't know if we're going to be actually harmonized, yes or no. And the last point is on the scope. So how do we define the scope of what exactly we're going to harmonize? So are we including some aspect that we should not, and are we excluding some aspect that we should? And who is able to adjust the scope as we move along? So in this specific case, by harmonizing the GHS, there was another related regulation, interpretation that was modified actually by Health Canada in the process. And this is how, so that was about how they treat confidential business information. So what has happened is that Canada has actually moved to a different regulation that is not harmonized anymore with the US. And they have introduced a process where we have to submit applications that are very costly. And at the end, unfortunately, as of today, actually the cost for this has actually totally wiped out all the benefits that GHS has been bringing until now. So I guess the learning is metrics drive behavior, and cost-benefit analysis should be included in this process, and accountability should be clear actually moving forward. Thank you.
Cindy, I'm going to jump over you for 1 second. Seeing as we're already on the RCC bandwagon, Dan, I know that this was something that you wanted to discuss in your capacity as advising on the RCC and some of the developments of late. So we'll go to you.
Yeah, and I think it's important whenever we're taking stock of successes and lack thereof or partial is just to take a look at where we came from and, or from where we came. And on both the B2B and RCC side, I mean, so often it's become almost cliche to say that, 9/11 changed everything, and of course it did. Many of us lost family and friends on that day and then what came after that. But, the border was broken before 9/11 in terms of staffing, infrastructure type issues. And in my personal view is we went from a period of that scenario to a situation on the border, and I'll quickly tie it back to the RCC, where we then had what I would call kind of the pasta theory phase, where in the wake of the events of that day, and we were reminded of some of those threats earlier this week, is that anything that we could do in terms of under the banner of security, we threw it against the wall and saw what stuck. And that created a great deal of disruption in the world's largest two-way trading relationship. And it's only been over the period of the last 5 or 6 years that we've been able to figure out in my favorite Canadian word, fulsome way, robust way, looking at what's working, what's not, and those types of things. But in some weird cycle, we've kind of come back to where we were, which in my view is, of all of the things that Jim and Joy and Elise mentioned, is that we're basically dealing, the reason why trusted trader programs, folks aren't seeing the benefit is, quite frankly, we don't have the infrastructure. So and Jim just mentioned that. I mean, if you're a truck sitting behind a truck that's not CTPAT or FAST approved or CTPAT cleared, you're waiting just as long as everybody else because there's not the infrastructure to stream the trade. If you're a car and you're sitting in the Detroit-Windsor tunnel and you can't get to the Nexus line, and as Sarah Hubbard said for many years, going way back, it doesn't help me to be underneath the tunnel waving my Nexus card when I can't get to the lane. Staffing continues to be an issue. But all of that came from, of course, and it's been 20 years and change, and since we did the NAFTA, and we created this environment where we would have free trade, fair trade between our 3 NAFTA partners, of course, the free trade agreement before and the auto pact, but we punted on the border. So we said, we're going to do all of this dealing and lower tariffs and access, and then, we kind of forgot that those things actually had to go to the border and cross. And so we were dealing with that, and then, and when we were doing this border visioning process, it really was almost, I hate to say it, an afterthought, the RCC, which was, what about the invisible border? And I know that we hear quite frequently in the recent discussions about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it's been the State Department's line that the TPP is the new NAFTA, is the update of NAFTA. I actually disagree with that. The Regulatory Cooperation Council, it has a Sesame Street type name, let's cooperate, because we couldn't say harmonize or align or anything like that. But that's actually the update to the NAFTA. That's all the work that was left to done. We reduced tariffs, but we didn't start talking about those behind-the-border type issues. And nobody's talking about issues where Canada and the U.S. actually disagree on the standards between health and safety, where there may be an honest disagreement. It's really, there's enough work just cleaning out the dumb differences that have panned out. For me, and I think for our clients, we consider the RCC the most important thing that our 2 governments are engaged in. This idea that you have regulators from the United States and regulators from Canada sitting there saying, point us to the differences where there's this misalignment and we'll fix it. And most importantly, I think the great success is that within the bureaucracies, they're actually being measured. As Elise just said, metrics matter. And anybody that knows how government service works, it's about what your performance evaluation says, and that helps you get your next gig or your raise or something like that. And that is part of the culture, and I think that's been the great success of the RCC. The failures have been, and I use that term in the most broadest definition. I think, one, it took some time to get it up and running. On the RCC side, it really trailed behind beyond the border. So the word's not out to the private sector, certainly not to the small and medium-sized enterprises. The most don't even know it exists. You say RCC, nobody knows what you're talking about, including probably 80% of the people in this room when we started this panel. And this is a Canada-US crowd, right? So that would be point one. The other is, and I thought we heard it today from Scott Buer and others, was that companies aren't exactly, those of us that advise companies aren't exactly in the business of saying, yeah, hey government, we have some regulatory misalignment on this product. Come look at the books and how we do things, right? You know, that's not exactly something companies, and particularly US companies, don't want government sniffing around what's going on, because invariably what can happen, or at least the potential is, that they'll start saying, you know what, that's a good idea. We didn't think to regulate that, you know, and that can happen. And that is a fear, whether how true it is or not, but I think that that's something we have to watch out for. And there have been a few unfortunate examples in the RCC process where we've seen things working, you know, things raised where all of a sudden you start seeing the standards misalign, and that's a challenge. And frankly, that has to be the no-no, is areas, to me, I think the most frustrating part is where we have the RCC, those of us as stakeholders that are out here pitching and trying to convince clients and get them over that fear factor, and all of a sudden there's another government agency that's either not part of the process, or maybe it's just somebody that's not aware that they should be coordinating with the other side of the border, and they announce a new rule. And everybody's like, wait a minute, where the hell did that come from that other participating government agency or other governmental actor? And that's where the bureaucracies, both at OIRA in the White House and it used to be at Privy Council office and Treasury Board, really need to watch out for that. Because we as the stakeholder community are out pitching this thing, and all of a sudden we're saying, hey, this is for real. The government is here and it's actually here to help. And then all of a sudden a reg comes out of nowhere and not through that process. And that needs to be watched out for. I would just conclude on the RCC side and saying it's somewhat unfortunate that, or maybe fortunate that we're meeting at this time, because there's been a little bit of a shakeup. There's always been an imbalance between Canada and the US on this. PCO, Privy Council Office, had a full-time individual devoted to this, Bob Carberry, and he had a team of sometimes up to about a dozen folks working full-time on this. I think it was probably about a half a dozen if you averaged it all out. At OIRA, which is part of OMB in the White House, you know, we had about 3 people working on it, and it was about 20% of their time, if that, trying to manage the RCC process. So there's always been this differential. Unfortunately, as things change in government, there's been some movement. On the Canadian side, RCC has been pushed over to the Treasury Board Secretariat, and public service, I mentioned I'm a part of it. We love all public servants, but our friends in Treasury Board don't get out much. For those of you that know them, I'm not sure that's the right agency to put that in terms of building buy-in, and I think Bob's retirement is really putting this at jeopardy as to where this process is all going, and I think we as the Canada-US stakeholder community need to take a look at that, whether this change is just typical bureaucratic change or whether this reflects a commitment or lack thereof to the RCC, because it's something we really and need to talk about this weekend as to what our response should be to that type of activity, because this needed another about 18 months, in my view, to really solidify within government bureaucracies, and this is a significant change. In particular, Bob Carberry, I think that is a significant loss at the bureaucratic level, Bob's retirement, for various reasons. So I think that's something we need to look at, and I'll stop there and flip it back over to you, Sarah. And we made it rain. That's how strong those comments were.
Oh my goodness.
I want people to start thinking about their questions for our illustrious panel. And while you do so, I'll ask you, Cindy, you mentioned that you spend an awful lot of your time dealing with nexus issues. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your experience with that.
Yes, and I'm going to have put up a picture that I saw on Twitter earlier today that really kind of defines where the Canadians feel at this particular point in time on the Beyond the Border and the RCC that the Eagle's going to come and kick the Canada Goose. There's still this fear that these two programs came out of a need to align security and trade. And there's been all this movement and all this activity, but there's still this fear that something can happen and all of a sudden there will be thickening of the border. Drink up.
Yeah.
And there's a fear that, just as Dan just said, that when you start trying to align and harmonize the regulatory regimes, that someone's going to come and kick you, and you didn't expect this would be the outcome of that activity. You go in wanting to harmonize and to make business easier, and then all of a sudden business becomes harder and business becomes more expensive. And I agree with everything that Joy said. You know, there's a big difference between large multinationals and small to medium-sized businesses. And for small to medium-sized businesses, it's a lot more expensive and there's a lot more work, and it's hard to keep up. With respect to Nexus, I do a ton of Nexus work, and that's been a great initiative that's come out of the Beyond the Border program and action plan. However, I've got the dirt. It doesn't work as well as it should. There's a lot of great success stories, there's a lot of movement, and you can pre-clear and you can fly domestically and not have to, you go through a shorter line through airport security. That's great, and it's a valuable asset to everyone, this Nexus card. But you're always at risk of it being taken away. For example, these are true stories. You're not going to believe me, but these are true stories. There's a Canadian businessman in his 50s dating a younger lady, quite attractive. He got his Nexus pass taken away at Toronto Pearson Airport by US Customs at pre-clearance because his girlfriend was too pretty. You must have lied to us when you said that she is your girlfriend. She must be a hooker. There's no other way she'd be with you. They took away his Nexus pass. Really, this is a true story. And the redress mechanism is for him to write a letter to the US CBP Ombudsman. It goes in by email. You don't hear anything for 11 months because the process on the US side is pretty opaque, and you don't have documents come back where you get to argue whether or not the customs officer was right or wrong, what it was that he wrote in the file. You just get an email back, no, we're not going to reinstate the Nexus card. On the Canadian side, there's actually a process where you get the officer's notes, you are able to write submissions, and in many cases, you're able to overturn the decision to cancel or revoke an individual's Nexus card. So there really is an accountability issue on both sides, and the customs officers have a lot of power. Another story, a Canadian businessman going down to the United States, US pre-clearance at Pearson Airport, got his Nexus pass taken away because his wife had a muffin in her purse. And gentlemen in the room, put your hands up if you go through your wife's purse when you're traveling together flying by air. How many people in the room do that on a routine basis? How many in the room would get their hands chopped off if they tried that? So they expected this gentleman, he should know better. He should know everything that's in his wife's purse and that she put a muffin in to eat on the plane. Another example for US Customs at Pearson Airport, I've got a whole lot, is a family went up, they had 3 children, husband, wife, and nanny. Nanny didn't have a Nexus card. All they did was walk up so that she could bring the strollers, because they had 2 strollers and they had the luggage, and asked, would it be okay for her to pre-clear with us? He said, oh, you asked the question, I'm taking away all of your Nexus cards. She could have gone back into the long lineup. It would have been no big deal, but no, all the Nexus passes got taken away. The Canadians do the same thing to the Americans, but I don't have as great stories. We see a lot of Nexus passes getting taken away by Canada Customs from Americans. Did you check the box? Are you carrying more than $10,000 Canadian? A lot of American travelers think, I don't have $10,000 US, I have $9,000 US with me. They check, no, it goes through the search, and $9,000 US converts to over $10,000 Canadian. It's $1 million Canadian now. And so they get their Nexus passes taken away because they didn't do the conversion on the currency. Another issue with American travelers is that you don't know what the liquor requirements are in Canada, and a lot of people bring 2 bottles of liquor, and it's over the threshold limit, and you've checked off that you're within the exemption limits, and you're not. And so that happens quite frequently as well. I have a whole host of stories of Canadians coming back to Canada, and one interesting one I'll share with the ladies in the room. A number of ladies who have expensive purses, so let's just say Gucci, who travel through Montreal Trudeau Airport. This is a big issue at Montreal Trudeau. They say, "Oh, did you buy this purse on your trip?" "No, I didn't buy this trip on my most recent trip." "I don't know, it smells pretty new to me," says the customs officer. "Well, no, I've had it for about 5 or 6 years. It really shouldn't smell that new." "Well, prove it to me on the spot. I want to see the receipt." "Well, I don't carry the receipt for this purse." "Well, tell me where you bought it." "Where I bought this one?" And they take away the Nexus Pass because they take the position that either A, they bought the purse on this particular trip and did not declare it, so it was an under-declaration, or B, they bought it on a previous trip to New York, let's say, and didn't declare it then. And the individual has to go back and prove where they bought this purse. And this has happened about 6 or 7 times in the last 4 or 5 months. And so it's little teeny tiny things. So this Nexus program is to facilitate travel. We identify the good guys and the people that have good records, and we're putting them in the fast lane so that, you know what, the US Customs and Canadian Customs can risk assess, and now we're shifting a whole bunch of people for no reason whatsoever into the long lineup for 6 years or more for really based on minor little infractions. And the redress procedure is lengthy, and as I mentioned before, one of the really big issues is on the US side, there really isn't a procedure to appeal a decision by a customs officer. And I've been told that, and so I believe it to be true, that if you are a Canadian who is filing a redress with the US CBP Ombudsman, you get put to the bottom of the pile. So it takes right now between 10 and 11 months to hear back to get that no. And American travelers, it's between 2 and 3 months. So there's a little bit of unfairness even in the process itself. The other big issue for Nexus cards is commercial goods. Under the Nexus program, if you have commercial goods, you cannot use a Nexus lane. And we do have determinations on both sides of the border as to whether or not your iPhone, your computer, your promotional materials that you've got in your briefcase are commercial goods that preclude you from being able to use the Nexus lane. We have a number of individuals who, have had promotional materials in the back of their car. They forgot that they were there. They crossed the border. They're located. And I've had some individuals who cross the border and get bath towels and various items with logos on them, and they say, well, they're commercial goods. You would use them in your business as opposed to using them personally. But the average person doesn't know the difference between casual goods and commercial goods. And so these determinations are being made on a legal issue, and that they've used the wrong lane in traffic, and they get their Nexus passes taken away because they aren't complying with customs rules that they know nothing about. So, while it's really great that we have the Nexus program, I don't think it's being applied the way it should be at the border for a variety of people. And there should be a 1 or 2 strike process, and there should be a real mechanism, because a Nexus pass is something of value. Business people who are doing cross-border business and are traveling on a regular basis, they want to use the airport security short lineup, and they want and need to be able to go through the Nexus lane to just facilitate their travel, just to cut time off. And a lot of these people, they get pulled into secondary inspection over and over and over again, so they have to build in on both, whether or not they're flying to the United States or flying back, they have to build in an extra hour to 2 hours for inspections and examinations just because they've got one infraction on their record, and it really is slowing down travel and is making people miss their flights. The other thing that I'd like to raise that has nothing to do with Nexus, but it's a good story from a Canadian perspective. How many U.S. customs lawyers in the room? Not that many. Well, in the United States, most of your customs rulings are posted publicly and online. We had a notification that came out last month that Canada has now started to do that, and we've got 125 total advance rulings that have been published online now. It's been an initiative that's been underway for about 3 or 4 years now, so we now have 125 tariff classification rulings. That's not very good, and if that's the pace that we're going, we might have 1,000
Put that in perspective to
in
the US.
2020.
How many would you say? That's about a day's work, almost, in the US.
In the U.S. it's literally
No,
thousands.
no, they'd get that done by lunch in the United States.
Yeah.
And so the reason why I'm raising that issue is we have a lack of transparency even within the customs process. There's more transparency and availability of information on the United States side. The maneuvering of the websites may not be as easy for Canadians, but on the Canadian side, we have a lack of information and a lack of transparency for Americans wanting to do business up in Canada. And what are our customs rules? What are our customs procedures? And are they classifying it correctly? What do the Canadians think about certain things? And that is something that we really have to move forward, because to improve cross-border trade, we really do have to address some of these issues. And one last thing that I have to follow up on what Joy said, where there's a lack of harmonization of rules, and I think you had mentioned the bugs don't know. I was at a client this past week, and they import grapes into Canada from California. And guess what, guys? They can't re-export those grapes back into the United States. If they overbuy, under the U.S. rules, the U.S. won't take back any of their grapes due to the fact that it's an agricultural product. So we have to somehow, if it's crossed the border once, it should be able to cross back. The birds can fly, and the migratory birds are fine, but poultry, we stop it at the border and raise all kinds of questions. So I think that there's a lot of room still to go, and I'll leave that with, those are a couple of the horror stories that I can share with you.
Go ahead, Joy.
Well, if I can just jump in, because that's actually the perfect segue for something that, we heard Jim start off by talking about, improvements at the border, and, if certain things could get done, 34 seconds per truck could be, realized. And then we heard Dan talk about an invisible border, and we just heard Cindy talk about, on the traveler side, all these Nexus horror stories, and we heard Elise talk about, the size of labeling and data sheets and things that's, really from a health, safety, and security standpoint, you sort of look at them and say, how did we get so far apart to begin with? I'd just like to raise one concept. All of that talks about the actual frontier point and the border point. There's actually something that, I've coined a term called the supply chain echo. And what the supply chain echo is after the goods actually clear that border, whether it's 34 seconds faster or slower, and they get to their final destination and the grapes are eaten or whatever it's processed or whatever is going to happen happens, that's not the end of the supply chain. From a regulatory standpoint, customs authorities on both sides of the border have up to 5 years, depending on which jurisdiction you're talking about, to audit. So 5 years after the grape was eaten, somebody's at your door questioning you about something, and there's actually some pretty egregious cases in Canada, and there have been egregious cases in the United States of what I'm going to call, because we're a nice friendly room here and we're amongst friends, border thickening, drink up, that it's actually administrative bullying that's happening. There was a case in Canada where Canadian importers of television sets, just like you and I have in our living rooms and stuff, and Cindy's nodding because she probably knows what I'm going to say, that imported it into Canada, they were given written rulings by Canada Customs saying, yep, that TV set right there, that model number, all the rest of it, you can bring it into this country duty-free using a tariff provision called 9948. In writing, ink was dry. Years later, the authorities show up and they say, oh, you know what? We're going to reinterpret that ruling that we gave you, and because it's got a USB port, I won't go into all the details, but because it has a USB port in the back, find me a TV today that doesn't have a USB port in the back. Come on. It's got a USB port in the back, and you're not actually using it as a monitor. Most people, did you get whoever bought the television set at Walmart, did they sign a certificate saying that they were going to use it as a monitor and actually use that USB port? Because if they didn't, we're going to charge you duty unless you have that signed form. So just imagine, 5 years after the television set was sold, you're talking today, you have to pay literally hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of duty on television sets that were sold years ago. That's administrative bullying, and that's an example of a supply chain echo. So we talk about 34 seconds, we talk about muffins and purses, and all that kind of stuff, but then there's that whole 5-year, it may be silent for a very long time, then there's a sonic boom at the end of it all. And it's that uncertainty as to whether or not for your product in that 5-year time, you're actually gonna hear a sonic boom, or whether or not it's gonna stay silent, that I think causes the highest levels of security. And that's not really being talked about right now, either at RCC and beyond the border. That's that invisible border that I think you were talking about, Dan.
I just have to ask the question though, and throw it out really to the audience, which is, what are we talking about? I mean, really, what are we talking about? I mean, this is how I make my living, and I'm almost ashamed of it, to be honest with you.
It's crazy.
Because
it's crazy.
This is insanity, right? I mean, I gotta be honest with you, I really have absolutely no problem with the officer that yanks a Nexus card for the blueberry muffin, right? Because the rules are, you should know who's coming across. That's his or her job, right? If we really want to have a discussion about beyond the border, we need to start talking about what we want a 21st century border to look like. That individual is charged with not only the Nexus card, but on the commercial goods side of stopping this. Do we really want, in the 21st century, in the world in which we live today, our border to be a customs clearinghouse? In this day and age, I mean, it made sense at one time when you couldn't track purchases and things like that, at the point where that's going to be leaving the country. But didn't we kind of envision that this would be one market in terms of the movement of commercial goods? And what just drives me insane is at the very same time that we are talking about negotiating agreements trade agreements around the world, and we're here, the Undersecretary and everybody else, we're talking about opening up all these markets, move them into an integrated North American market, but we are just putting choke points up all along the way. It's an inconsistent strategy, and that's before we even start talking about the issue that we talked about before dinner, which is the transportation side of things. Because I can tell you what, the transportation guys aren't talking about the border. They can tell you how to get to the border, and it's like, oh, we've created the structure, but then that's GSA's job, and that's somebody else's. Federal Highways doesn't want to touch it. I mean, we need to really, if we're going to have a beyond the border type vision, one thing that made me almost proud to be from the U.S., because the U.S. was not always the first to do a lot of these things, and Deborah Myers will talk about this tomorrow, was known employer, which is really starting to look at how do you move people in a different way and streamlining that process for those that are moving a lot of other people. But I just have to ask, if you are a small and medium-sized company, and I represent a lot of these folks, if they were sitting in this room right now, they would say, I am not sending anything into Canada. I'll just sit here and exist in my market, which may be, Kansas, not Canada. Yeah. And that makes us less economically competitive at the end of the day. So I think one of the challenges for us, and there's been some great papers and NORAD for the border and all of that, but what do we really want US CBP and CBSA doing at the Canada-US border? One, definitely security, but do we want them to be tax collectors still?
Exactly.
Exactly.
I
don't know.
I agree
Should
with
they be
that.
looking at Gucci and Louis Vuitton purses? I've bought enough of those in my life, which just shows how pathetic I am. But I try to buy love, and it just doesn't work. But in any event.
Oh, tell us about it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I was whining earlier about my dating. I think you've picked up on the theme today.
So of course we have a lot of
I digress.
we have a lot of experts in the crowd tonight as well. So if you have comments, if you want to answer Dan's 21st century border question, what should it look like? Please feel free to put up your hand, or if you have a question for our panel, if if there are any.
Eric?
Eric, go ahead.
You just ruined any chance of Potbelly sponsoring this event. Thank you for that.
Do we have any other questions or comments?
Given the current status, thank God for email and telephone, because if we had to run back and forth with this communication, we'd be no business at all.
There was another question or comment directly behind you.
what's even funny? You know what's even funny, Mr. Speaker, is that the bureaucrats will often go to Jim and Joy and other organizations represented here and ask them to advocate for changes in legislation. I mean, on or off the record. And I mean, it's, you know, they recognize that even it's insane and have to do it that way, but there's just got to be a better way to do this on that. I mean, I think, you know, the bureaucrats themselves need cover. You know, I think what we have to think about as the stakeholder community is what we want that vision to look like and go, I think your point is spot on, is how do we get the cover? My fear is the picture that we just saw. I don't think we're going to see fear, you know, regardless of who wins in November. I don't think we're going to see fundamental changes on, I really just don't believe it, that we're going to see fundamental changes on the border. I have my own political views on that, but you know, one of the interesting things was during the last transition in administration, what we saw from the Bush administration was political appointees right about 6 to 8 months before started becoming full-time employees, not political appointees within their system, so that they stayed on through the transition. I'm curious to see if that happens again, because that ensured some institutional memory within the bureaucracy. But I do think there's a very real danger. I just know parenthetically, changing the names of these things, rebranding, I realize the political need to do that. I think it's a really bad idea. RCC, one, frankly, has a legal reason why it's called that in the U.S. That can't be changed unless you fundamentally change it. And B2B now has taken on a meaning, I think, within the stakeholder groups. I think it's a bad rebranding exercise, and we should maybe think about whether we want to call for that or not as a stakeholder community. I think it's taken on a life of its. It means something now. Words have meaning, and I think we need to really think about that before we somewhat recognize the political reality of that everybody's going to want things to be their own. I think we potentially say, no, this is beyond a political administration, and think about it from that perspective, but that's just I'm opining now rather than.
Well, Dan, just going back to something that you said earlier, like speaking as a Canadian, Bob Carberry was fundamental. As a Canadian bureaucrat, he was fundamental. He got it from a business perspective. He's someone who actually understands. He got it. He connected the dots. He was extremely effective in working through that Canadian bureaucracy that you were talking about. That I think you're right. It is revered differently in Canada, and that it's almost like little fiefdoms in little, you know, I'm a DG, I'm a Director General, and this is my little kingdom, and I'm going to do it the way I want to do it. And Bob was extremely efficient at cutting through that stuff, extremely efficient at looking at what the issue was on the business side of the table, nodding, I get it, and cutting through the crap, pardon my language, to get to the point. And I think on our side of the table, it's a real loss that he was sort of they shuffled the deck and he was shuffled right out. And I personally think we fixed something that was not broken. And as a Canadian, I'm just shaking my head, saying I'm at a loss for that one. I understand we have a new government and whatever else, but Bob Carberry was not politically affiliated. He was a bureaucrat, long career, lifetime bureaucrat. To me, we fixed something that wasn't broken, and I'm just hoping that that bell can be unrung, but I don't hold out great hope.
Just want to take the other side of the argument of what you were saying, is that, you know, if we say we don't want these governments to make it their own, the danger of them not making it their own is that it's going to be buried in a drawer in Treasury Board at some level, and the initiative would just kind of carry along, but without any major improvements.
But if we don't have any major improvements, then, and I didn't mean it with the American election, if something should happen like last weekend where it thickens the border and there's a concern again, then everything that everyone's been working on for 5 years will be for naught. What we've been trying to do, and what all of this has been about, is, you know what? Trade will continue despite what's happening in the global marketplace, which is unstable at this point in time. Things happen internationally, globally, but we need to maintain our trade ties and make sure that trade remains efficient and doesn't get bogged down because of something beyond the control of the businesses who are trying to continue to do business with one another.
I think public safety can be balanced with common sense and still, you know, sovereign policy. I think that I think it is possible to do that. If it has to be more than political willingness, it has to also be bureaucratic willingness, because there's the political level and there's a bureaucratic level.
Doesn't that expose, though, a weakness of the Canada-U.S. business community, is that we're sitting here saying that all of the facts and figures that we throw out, everything we've talked about all day, and we're saying that because a bureaucrat or a policymaker may want this to look like their own thing, that we don't have the capability to influence that decision and say, no, this is bigger than you. I mean, at which point do we kind of look ourselves in the mirror and say, we need to flex a little bit more than we are and use the levers of influence, such as, look, I'm an American and our system runs by two things, three things. Voice, voice vote, one. Two, money. And three, NIMBY, which is, this is negatively impacting me and I'm going to launch an advocacy campaign. But at which point do we just stop saying, this is bigger than you. This is about our economic security. This is our company. And get on board or you're out. And what I love about your system, you can throw them out in 6 weeks. We're going to have to wait 4 years to throw Trump out.
Who can we throw out? Who can we throw out in 6 weeks? What?
So,
Not in a majority government.
but I'm just teeing that up as an issue, just as a thought. I mean, we're always kind of like scared. And at which point do we just say that enough is enough?
Well, we have a majority government this time, so we
don't
can't
throw
throw
them out.
ours out either. I mean, we went with the minority for years, a minority government, which you're right, then we can change things quickly. But when they win a majority, we're just like you, we're stuck for blocks of time.
Do we have one more question from the
It's
floor?
over there.
There's a young lady here.
If I can just take a first stab at that. Since the financial, the question was basically that the information is out there on the RCC and Beyond the Border on both the U.S. websites and Canadian websites. So what can we do to help small to medium-sized companies get their hands on that information? Is that a fair way to encapsulate the question? My thoughts there, ever since the financial meltdown, companies tightened their belts to survive during that financial crisis time. And despite the fact markets have rebounded and whatever else, there's still trepidation, and companies are still working with only the absolute barest minimum, at least I'm talking from the Canadian standpoint, of people that they need. So even if you had websites with flashing lights and dancing girls across the top and whatever, they don't have time to read the website. Reading websites, that's just not real. They don't have time for that. As it is, I mean, I don't actually know what the statistics are, but I can tell you the average small to medium-sized business person works way more than 40 hours a week. Way more. And in order for them to really be, trying to make real gains, there's probably not enough hours in the week. And then to actually look at bringing on more staff or hiring consultants or whatever else is financial, I don't want to call them risks, but it's financial decisions that they have to make, that they have to weigh the pros and cons, and there's nothing at this point that tells them that it would be really worth their while to hire somebody like a Dan or a Cindy to help them figure out what Beyond the Border means, because it's still not really tangible to them. They're just trying to get through and make it through, the next payroll cycle. So I don't know the answer to your question, other than I think once they actually start to feel that there's true economic prosperity on the doorstep, and that they have I'm going to call it the confidence and the courage to actually say, you know what, it's time, I think I can spread my wings, I think it's safe, I don't think the eagle's actually going to kick me in the head if you're a Canadian, but I don't know when that's going to come. And as I said in my earlier remarks, the fact that we just have a brand new government, and there's a lot of people who are like, oh, thank goodness we have a brand new government. And then there's a lot of people who say, we now have a drama teacher as as a prime minister, you know, and then the US elections are coming up and nobody knows what's going to happen there. So there's lots of things, and then there's Brexit. Is the UK, we just finished negotiating a free trade agreement with Europe, and it's about to start the ratification process. Now, is England actually going to be in the deal or out of the deal? We don't even know who's going to be in the deal that we just finished. So there's lots of things that like make it kind of not maybe scary, but uncertain. So I don't think that they're going to spread their wings anytime soon.
You know, I might just make a point. It might be very fertile for, on the U.S. side, for the Commerce Department, and maybe for Industry Canada on the Canadian side, if they were asked to put together a summary paper of what's in beyond the border to the benefit of SMEs. Everybody talks a good game for SMEs, but listening to Joy, if they don't have the staff and they don't have the time, who better than Commerce and Industry Canada to tell their own companies how they could benefit from understanding what's going on? And that might be something that ought to be an ask to those two places, to put out a paper and distribute it to all of the SMEs in both countries.
And Jim, that's brilliant, and I would even say trickle that down, because most of the SMEs that trade, they may deal with the U.S. Commercial Service, but I can tell you, and I love our Ohio Development Service Agency and Jobs Ohio folks that we have here and throughout the states where we work with the local export assistance centers and places like that. How many of them know what's in a B2B and RCC? I would put that percentage as very, very low. But I'll answer the flip side of your question. The small and medium-sized enterprise that gets the order in their website, you know, from their website shipping into Canada, you know what the biggest disincentive to them is going to be? When they ship that product and it's either turned around, or they go to make the sales call and they get turned around at the border. They will not do it again.
Yeah.
You've right there on something like business visitor travel, which is a mess right now between Canada and the United States. If we don't clean that up, it's the biggest disincentive, I think, to cross-border trade, is the lack of clarity on what is a business visitor and what isn't. And the minute that person goes to cross the border and is turned around, they ain't coming back. And no lawyer or customs broker or service provider is going to be able to convince them to do that again. So we need to watch out for the disincentives just as much as the incentives.
But I can point out something that U.S. Customs does well. So with the NAFTA verification that I had last week, 2 U.S. Customs officers came up to visit my client, and they brought materials with them, short documents, not papers that were 25 to 80 pages long. It was 2 or 3 pages, and they came in with the approach, we want to help you do business in the United States within our jurisdiction, not we're coming here to make sure that you never do business with us again. And that was huge, because they brought some information that was extremely helpful on CT, PAT, and PIP, for example, that my clients weren't that familiar with, a short little brochure. And they said, you know what, we might even sign up for this program. The Canadians, on the other hand, when the CBSA goes into a U.S. company, they don't bring these sorts of materials saying, how can we help you do business with us? And so there is this disconnect, even within my own remarks today, that there's a lot of pettiness with U.S. Customs and with Canada Border Services Agency, but there are some good programs and some very good officers, and I think it comes down to some very good individuals who actually get it, or have people within their organization that they're working with that get it, and there can be a communication of information between people that we deal with, and small to medium-sized businesses deal with in the course of their business, but they approach it from how I'm here to help you, as opposed to I'm here to trick you or I'm here to stop you. That will go a long way.
And in Canada, the federal government for the past few years has actually allocated a budget, I don't know exactly how much it is, where they run television ads, Action Canada, where you can find out all kinds of things about services that the government has for small to medium-sized businesses, services that the government has for individuals, and that sort of thing. Yet we have something in Canada called the Trade Commissioner Service, which is meant to help Canadian exporters and their Canadian export officers that are based on foreign soil. Never once did they run one of those ads. Never once have they run an ad on Beyond the Border to actually help small to medium-sized business, you know, while sitting in their living room, focus and understand that there maybe is something there for them. Instead, those ads tend to always have a slightly political spin to them, right? We're building
Bridges
roads for you, and you know, whatever.
Now, is the reality CBSA show, is that part of the advertising?
been
I love
canceled.
that
No,
show.
but
I love that
just
show.
It was just
that show
canceled.
just got
It
canceled
just-
because they breached somebody's privacy because there's a lawsuit on it. So the case is, the show's actually been pulled.
But Border Security America's Frontline just started, so we now can see the
Yeah.
U.S. Customs officers.
Yeah, but the Canadian one,
And I
they
can
yanked it
guarantee you
due to
there'll be a lawsuit
privacy.
on that one.
There'll be a lawsuit on that one before too long.
So we should probably wrap it.
Yes.
There was a gentleman over here that had
Yes,
his hand up.
he's had his.
You know what?
He's had his hand up over
The
here.
one in the back.
Okay, we'll take that one last question over here, and then we're gonna.
This gentleman
No,
over
the-
here.
The one in the back, he
Yeah,
had his
yeah.
hand up a long, long time. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. There's actually rules at the global level as to what data elements countries are supposed to exchange or have available to each other and whatever else on a global scale. Jim and I both sit on the Border Commercial Consultative Committee, which is a Canadian CBSA committee that consults with business. And one of the biggest things Jim, how many hours have we spent talking about which data elements should be required? And one of the questions we're constantly asking from a Canadian standpoint, and then Jim's pointing out what's the reality for the US, sometimes the US will ask for 5 data elements on a shipment, exactly the same product, same shipment. The Canadians will say, well, we want 6 or 4. And it's a question of what, like, can't we just all get together and decide what data elements do the two governments want on this, and at what time do they want it so that they can inspect if they want to stop the shipment and that? And is that not like one of the biggest convoluted, how long have you been talking about that, Jim?
A long time. But I think on the single window, they have agreed, have they not?
Yep, single window is,
240, whatever it is.
well, it depends on the PGA and so the partnering government agencies, single window, one of the issues with single windows, we had some of the agencies stepped up and said, oh, look, a single window where we're going to be able to ask for data. I've always wished we could ask for these 4 extra elements, data elements, even though they're not part of the regs. And we had to like beat them off with a stick saying, you can't have those data elements, they're not in the regs. But you know, it was the wish list kind of thing, and you know that that's true as well. So I think we were successful there. But to your point, I think what you're asking is why isn't common sense used?
Like the technology. Yes.
There's a very, we did a cross-border hackathon. We partnered with the U.S. Chamber and North of 41, and Jeff Musson, I think, will talk a little bit about it tomorrow, but we had hackers in Toronto and Chicago, and it was one of the most eye-opening events for me. It was life-changing in many ways because these folks who had nothing, didn't even know each other, most of them, which still amazed me that people would show up on a Friday night and hang out for the rest of the weekend with 3 people or 4 people that they didn't know. Now, after like 72 hours, they kind of start to stink, by the way. But they hang out and they were solving border problems, like how to make it easy to export. They figured out in 20 hours what it's taken me 20 years to learn. And what it demonstrates, I mean, at the end of the day, these folks were able to come up with an app where they took a picture of a Sprite can, and that pulled all the publicly available information about the Sprite can, all the forms that they would need to ship that across the border, and populated that using IBM Watson technology. And my personal view, based on that experience and many more, is that there is no place on earth more ripe for technology disruption right now than the Canada-U.S. border. I mean, it's just these kids spend 72, no, not kids, but 72 hours, and they said, boy, that technology's ancient that they use at CBSA and USCBP. And I went, oh God, this has been the upgrade. This is stuff. Some of this stuff hasn't even been deployed yet. And this is supposed to be the new stuff. So I think we got to think about that as well. I mean, and there's got to be some smart people that know how to do that didn't go to law school that actually have skills.
The CBSA infrastructure.
Able to do that.
Sorry. The CBSA infrastructure, like the software and the platforms, and I'm not a techie person, but that CBSA is currently using, they're about to change it, but what they're currently using today, right now at the border, $2 billion a day or whatever it was Sarah was saying earlier, was actually deployed and implemented in the late 1980s.
And
I
on
think
that
says
note,
it all.
this,
Okay, just a quick programming note. Tomorrow is a little bit more government official day, so we do ask, Ambassador Heyman will be here as the first speaker in the morning. We want to make sure that those of you that are interested in hearing him are all here, and that he is very interested in speaking to all of you. So if you could be up bright and early, probably shouldn't have kept you here until 9:20, but and served you booze to boot. But if you could be here in the morning, and then we will rock and roll throughout the day tomorrow, ending before the Cavs tip off tomorrow night. So we'll see you in the morning. Any questions, comments, and concerns? What's that? Shuttles are outside on the front door for those of you going back to the hotel. There are a number of people with vehicles as well.
Cards are over there. Okay.
Thank you, Sarah.
Very nicely done, Sarah. Thank you.